Edda Göring's life began in 1938 under the shadow of the Third Reich. Born to one of the most notorious figures in Nazi Germany, Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring. She was in every sense the crown princess of the regime, lavish with extraordinary privileges from the moment she entered the world. For her baptism, she received a miniature palace and a masterpiece painting, while the roar of 500 Luftwaffe jets overhead marked her entry into a life of unthinkable luxury and attention. Her father, a man both feared and revered, treated her as the embodiment of the perfect German future, a living symbol of the ideals he promoted. Life at Carenhall, the family's forest estate, was a constant display of wealth and extravagance, with Renaissance art, rare jewels, and a fleet of servants surrounding her every need. Edda grew up with the certainty that her life was exceptional, that her father's status insulated her from the ordinary world, and that she could never face any real adversity. Yet this gilded life was built on foundations of unimaginable violence. Hermann Göring was not only a leading architect of the Holocaust, but also a man whose obsession with power and wealth defined every action. While Edda played in the halls of her miniature palace, the machinery of destruction and oppression hummed in the background. As she took her first steps and learned to speak, entire nations were being plunged into chaos by the man who called her his little sunbeam. The contrast between her world of toys, fine clothes, and adoring attention and the reality of the suffering outside the walls of Carenhall could not have been more stark. Her childhood, in essence, was a fairy tale built upon a nightmare. The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 transformed Edda's world overnight. The fantasy life she had known, a life surrounded by opulence and unquestioned privilege, disintegrated in the face of the Allied advance. One day, she was the pampered daughter of Germany's second most powerful man. The next, she was whisked away from Carenhall, fleeing for her life in the Bavarian Alps as the family estate was looted and destroyed. Her transition from privilege to displacement was brutal and incomprehensible for a child of 7. The Allies and the post-war German authorities, intent on preventing the resurgence of Nazi influence, treated the surviving children of high-ranking Nazis not as innocents, but as extensions of their parents' crimes. Edda's possessions, from Renaissance paintings to exquisite jewelry, were seized under the logic of denazification, an attempt not only to punish the guilty, but to erase their legacy entirely. Her private palace was replaced by the stark walls of internment camps, where she shared cramped quarters with other children and mothers, living under strict surveillance. The psychological shock of suddenly being treated as a problem, rather than a princess, was immense. Edda, who had known nothing but indulgence and adoration, was confronted with a world where her name was a liability, her family a symbol of terror, and her very existence a reminder of the crimes of the regime her father had led. She was forced to navigate a society that not only stripped her material wealth, but sought to condition her to reject her father, to see him as history saw him, a monster. But the young girl did not respond to this attempted reprogramming with despair or repentance. Instead, she internalized a different lesson, that loyalty to her father was paramount, and that the outside world's judgment could never dictate her private beliefs. In this crucible of deprivation, humiliation, and isolation, Edda's lifelong adherence to her father's memory and the stubborn refusal to denounce him began to form as Edda grew older. The struggle over her father's possessions became a defining part of her life. The most famous of these battles involved the Madonna and Child, painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, gifted to her by the city of Cologne in 1938. After the war, Cologne demanded its return, claiming that the gift was made under duress by the second most powerful man in Germany. Edda, who had trained as a lawyer, refused to relinquish it, arguing that the painting was a personal gift to her as a child and therefore not subject to seizure. For 15 years, she fought the German state in court, asserting her right to retain the family treasures. In 1954, she won the return of some jewelry valued at 150,000 Deutschmarks, a victory that proved the enduring influence of the Göring name even in post-war Germany. Her legal battles were not merely about wealth, but about identity, memory, and the preservation of personal narrative in a world determined to erase her family's legacy. The courts eventually ruled against her regarding the painting in 1968, asserting that gifts given to children of dictators under duress were not legally valid, marking the formal end of Göring privilege. Yet, even in defeat, Edda's stubbornness never wavered. She maintained her loyalty to her father, keeping portraits of him in her Munich apartment and displaying the family crest. To her, these possessions were not symbols of wealth or power, but links to a childhood of love and security, a counterweight to the world's relentless condemnation of her father. Through these legal struggles, Edda became a living testament to the complexity of human attachment and loyalty. Her refusal to denounce her father or submit to public shaming reflects a psychological landscape shaped by a mixture of innocence, indoctrination, and extreme privations of her early post-war life. By the 1950s, West Germany was attempting to rebuild, yet Edda remained trapped in the legacy of her father's infamy, living in a modest Munich apartment. She took a job as a medical clerk, a quiet and unassuming position that allowed her to exist under the radar. Her daily life was defined by social exile. Her surname, Göring, was enough to trigger suspicion and social ostracism. While the country celebrated the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed ruins into modern prosperity, Edda was confined to a world of monitored poverty, surviving on a modest salary, and occasional sales of items that had escaped post-war seizures. She navigated bureaucracies, applied for housing, and interacted with neighbors while remaining largely invisible, never engaging in public life, and meticulously avoiding the press. This invisibility was a form of protection and a survival mechanism. Unlike other children of Nazi leaders, such as Gudrun Himmler, who actively engaged in political causes, or Nicholas Frank, who publicly denounced his father, Edda refused to engage in either extreme. She did not become a neo-Nazi activist, nor did she repudiate her father publicly. She existed in a private bubble where her father remained a doting figure, removed from the horrors his political and military actions had wrought. Her life in Munich, therefore, was a complex negotiation between survival and loyalty, visibility and anonymity, shame and pride. It was a careful balancing act, maintaining a semblance of normalcy while privately preserving the memory of her father as she had experienced him, a man who loved his daughter despite the monstrous consequences of his actions elsewhere. In her final years, Edda Göring began to speak more openly, though never in the confessional style that journalists had sought. Until her death in December 2018, she refused to participate in tell-all interviews, preserving a code of silence that protected both herself and her father's image. When she finally did speak, the revelations were less about wealth or secrets and more about the unbroken loyalty and psychological armor that defined her life. She expressed a deeply human perspective, that she had been treated as a political prisoner, that the state had imposed a lifelong punishment on her, and that she had never seen her father as the monster the world insisted he was. To Edda, Hermann Göring remained Papa, the man who had given her dolls comfort and attention. She refused to acknowledge the Holocaust or the atrocities committed under her father's command as part of her private understanding of him. In her mind, the post-war seizures, internment, and social isolation had deprived her of a normal childhood and enforced an unfair narrative upon her life. She lived as a guardian of her own truth, a lifelong protest against the judgment of history and the forces that had stripped her of her family, her home, and her possessions. Her death was deliberately obscured by authorities, with no public funeral or marked grave, reflecting both the lingering fear of her symbolic power and the continued attempt to contain the legacy of the Göring name. Yet, in a sense, Edda won by maintaining control over her private narrative, living and dying on her own terms, a quiet, stubborn keeper of a dark flame. Edda Göring's education was a carefully curated affair, designed to reinforce her status as the daughter of one of the most powerful men in Germany. Unlike ordinary children who attended public schools or even private schools with modest curricula, Edda was tutored at home by governesses trained in multiple disciplines, including languages, history, music, and art. She learned French, English, and later Italian, all intended to reflect her father's ambitions of creating a European aristocratic elite loyal to the Reich. She was instructed not only in academic subjects, but also in deportment, etiquette, and the performance of privilege, how to sit, how to speak, how to interact with adults, and how to behave as a princess of the Third Reich. This upbringing, while rich in knowledge and cultural exposure, was also intensely isolating. She spent most of her early years within the walls of Hall, rarely mingling with children her own age, and her playtime was structured and monitored. Despite the abundance of material wealth, luxury dolls, fine clothing, and access to Hall's vast gardens, Edda's childhood was tightly controlled. Her father's presence loomed large, both physically and psychologically. Hermann Göring was a man who combined charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness. He was deeply indulgent toward his daughter, but also instilled a sense of exceptionalism that bordered on ideological indoctrination. From an early age, Edda internalized the belief that her family occupied a unique place in history, and that she herself carried the symbolic weight of her father's ambitions. Yet this education came with invisible costs. While she was learning French verbs and Renaissance art techniques, the rest of Germany was falling into war and chaos. Children her age in Berlin and Munich were suffering bombings, hunger, and displacement, while she remained insulated from the immediate horrors of conflict. This sheltered upbringing, however, did not inoculate her against the consequences of her father's choices. When the war ended, the very privileges that had defined her identity became sources of vulnerability, as her surname and lineage mark her as a symbol of everything the world had condemned. Although Edda spent much of her early childhood in isolation, she could not escape the realities of World War II, especially as Allied bombing campaigns intensified in the 1940s. The family's Carenhall estate, located in the Brandenburg Forest, was considered relatively safe compared to Berlin, but no location in Germany was entirely secure. Air raid sirens and the distant sounds of bombing occasionally pierced the idyllic setting of her playgrounds, reminding her, even at a young age, of the pervasive danger surrounding the Reich. Yet, unlike ordinary German children who experience fear and deprivation firsthand, Edda's exposure to danger was mediated by layers of protection. Servants would shelter her during air raids, and her father personally ensured that her needs were met, whether it was food, comfort, or entertainment. Still, the psychological impact of witnessing, however indirectly, the destruction around her was significant. The war was not a distant abstraction. She saw soldiers, refugees, and injured civilians, all of whom became part of the tapestry of fear and obedience that defined life under the Nazi regime. This environment cultivated a duality in Edda's experience, a childhood of opulence and attention, alongside an acute awareness of the fragility of life and the omnipresent threat of violence. The dissonance between the luxury of Carenhall and the devastation outside its walls may have contributed to the development of her enduring sense of loyalty to her father. She came to associate his power and protection with survival, even as she was surrounded by evidence of the catastrophic consequences of the system he helped enforce. By the time she turned 7, the war was ending, and the walls that had sheltered her for so long were no longer sufficient to shield her from the world's judgment. The sudden collapse of the Third Reich forced her into a liminal state between childhood and adult awareness, where comfort and fear existed simultaneously, shaping the personality that would carry her through a lifetime of legal battles, social scrutiny, and private devotion. The family estate of Carenhall was more than a home. It was a symbol of the Göring family's extraordinary status within the Nazi hierarchy. Built and expanded by Hermann Göring as both a personal residence and a showcase of power, it contained vast halls, priceless art, and elaborate gardens. Edda's early life was marked by the abundance and splendor typical of elite households, but Carenhall also served as a constant reminder of her father's political ambitions. From a young age, she learned to navigate an environment where opulence was intertwined with authority, and where every object, from tapestries to sculptures, was laden with meaning. For Edda, the estate was both a playground and a classroom. She played in the gardens, wandered through art galleries, and attended lessons conducted in rooms filled with historical artifacts, all while absorbing the messages of power, loyalty, and exceptionalism. Yet Carenhall's grandeur made it a target for retribution as the war drew to a close. In April 1945, the advancing Soviet army forced the Görings to flee, and the estate was subsequently looted and burned. The destruction of Carenhall was not only a loss of physical property, but also the symbolic annihilation of Edda's childhood. The world she had known, the one defined by security, luxury, and her father's constant attention, vanished almost overnight. In the aftermath, she and her mother retreated to Obersalzberg, the mountains near Berchtesgaden, where the family had previously maintained residence. Even in exile, the imprint of Carenhall remained. Memories of toys, servants, and the constant attention of her father became intertwined with trauma and loss. Edda's early experiences in Carenhall, both the luxury and the eventual destruction, framed a lens through which she understood the world for the rest of her life. The palace had been her entire universe, and when it disappeared, She was forced to navigate a society that not only rejected her father's legacy, but sought to erase her family from history entirely. Edda Göring's adolescence unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in German history, a time when the nation was grappling with the aftermath of total defeat, occupation, and denazification. For most teenagers, adolescence is a period of self-discovery, social interaction, and exploration. For Edda, however, it was defined by scrutiny, displacement, and the burden of her father's infamy. After the war, she and her mother were forced to relocate multiple times, fleeing from cities devastated by bombings, and navigating a country divided into occupation zones controlled by the Allied powers. Her family's name, once a symbol of power and privilege, now marked her for suspicion and social isolation. People in her neighborhood often treated her with hostility or fear, and the weight of historical judgment was inescapable. Schooling, which had once been conducted privately in the protected environment of Carenhall, now required adaptation to more conventional settings. Edda struggled with both practical and emotional challenges. The loss of luxury, the absence of stable home, and the constant reminder that her father's actions had contributed to Germany's destruction. Yet, despite these hardships, she maintained a remarkable degree of resilience. She continued to excel academically and remained focused on languages, literature, and music, reflecting the intensive training she had received in childhood. Her mother, Emmy Göring, played a crucial role during these years, providing emotional support, guidance, and a framework for navigating the social stigma that surrounded them. Together, they managed to carve out a small sphere of normalcy, although the shadow of Hermann Göring's legacy loomed over every aspect of daily life. Adolescence for Edda was therefore a complex mixture of grief, adaptation, and self-preservation, shaping a personality capable of enduring public scrutiny while maintaining private dignity. The experience instilled in her a nuanced understanding of power, responsibility, and the consequences of historical actions, lessons that would define her later interactions with both the legal system and the media. The loss of her childhood home, the societal rejection, and the burden of her father's crimes combined to produce an acute awareness that her life would always be entwined with Germany's darkest historical chapter. These formative experiences, while painful, laid the foundation for her later strength, discretion, and the ability to navigate the delicate line between public perception and personal identity as Edda entered adulthood. She faced the unique challenge of establishing a personal life in the shadow of her father's notoriety. Hermann Göring had been tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes, and sentenced to death, leaving Edda with a legacy of being the daughter of one of the most infamous figures of the 20th century. This association brought intense public attention and, in some cases, legal scrutiny over the family's remaining assets and property. Much of the Göring family wealth had been confiscated by Allied authorities or destroyed in the chaos of war, but disputes over inheritance, art collections, and personal possessions persisted. Edda, guided by her mother and legal counsel, became involved in various proceedings that required careful navigation of post-war German and international law. Her position was delicate. On one hand, she was entitled to some inheritance as a legal heir. On the other, public opinion and legal authorities were often hostile due to her familial connection. Socially, she encountered persistent stigma. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives sometimes treated her differently, either out of fear, moral judgment, or curiosity. Despite these challenges, Edda cultivated a private life that emphasized discretion and independence. She carefully selected her social circles, often connecting with individuals who were either sympathetic or who maintained a respectful distance from her father's historical notoriety. This approach reflected a combination of self-protection and personal intelligence, allowing her to navigate a world that was simultaneously fascinated by and repelled by her lineage. Edda's legal and social navigation illustrates the broader struggle of children of infamous historical figures, reconciling personal identity with inherited historical responsibility. While she bore no direct responsibility for her father's crimes, the symbolic weight of his actions followed her throughout her life, influencing decisions about education, property, and social engagement. These experiences required a level of maturity and resilience uncommon among young adults, further reinforcing the impact of her early upbringing and the lessons learned in the privileged but highly controlled environment of Carenhall. Over time, Edda developed strategies for maintaining privacy while addressing the necessary legal and financial matters, balancing public scrutiny with personal dignity. Her ability to navigate these complexities is a testament not only to her intelligence, but also to the formative influence of her unique childhood. Despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her upbringing, Edda Göring sought to establish personal connections and relationships that allowed her to experience aspects of normal adult life. Romantic relationships, friendships, and professional networks were all influenced by the lingering public perception of her family, requiring caution and discernment in choosing companions. She tended to cultivate relationships with individuals who respected her privacy and who understood the historical sensitivities tied to her identity. This careful approach extended potential marriage prospects and professional acquaintances, as any association had the potential to attract public scrutiny or media attention. Edda's private life remained remarkably shielded from the press, a stark contrast to the intense fascination with her father during his lifetime. Through these relationships, she found a degree of emotional stability, companionship, and personal fulfillment that contrasted sharply with the instability of her adolescence. Her ability to maintain privacy reflects both her upbringing and her strategic understanding of the consequences of public exposure. The lessons learned during her early years, both the cultural sophistication and the awareness of social consequences, allowed her to navigate personal interactions with discretion and confidence. Over time, Edda's circle relationships, though relatively limited, provided a source of support and continuity that helped her manage the enduring public curiosity about her father. Her private life demonstrates the duality of existence for individuals connected to infamous figures. The desire for normalcy coexists with the necessity of caution, shaping choices that may seem unconventional to outsiders but are essential for maintaining autonomy and dignity. Through careful cultivation of social connections, Edda carved out a space in which she could live with some degree of freedom and personal satisfaction, even as the shadow of history remained ever present as Edda Göring moved into her later years. The pattern of seeking privacy and discretion remained central to her life. Unlike many descendants of historical figures who may choose public engagement or media commentary, she consistently avoided interviews, public appearances, or any form of self-promotion. This deliberate choice allowed her to distance herself from the pervasive association with her father, Hermann Göring, and the notoriety of a Nazi regime. She lived in relative seclusion in various parts of Germany, often maintaining contact only with close friends and trusted family members. Despite her private life, she remained aware of her historical significance. Scholars, journalists, and historians occasionally reached out to her for insight or context regarding her father's personal life, but she was careful in providing commentary, often choosing silence or carefully crafted statements over sensational narratives. Her discretion reflected a combination of personal resilience and an understanding of how public exposure could compromise both her privacy and her dignity. Edda also maintained an interest in cultural pursuits such as literature, music, and art, areas in which she had been trained from childhood. These interests offered both intellectual fulfillment and a private refuge from the pressures of her family history. Her ability to cultivate a meaningful private life, while managing the unavoidable scrutiny tied to her identity, illustrates a unique form of agency. Even in her later years, Edda's life was a balancing act. She remained aware of the public fascination with her family, but refused to allow it to dictate her personal choices. By maintaining autonomy over her private life, she demonstrated that it was possible to exist meaningfully in the shadow of historical infamy without surrendering personal dignity. Her approach to privacy has been widely noted by historians as an example of how descendants of controversial figures navigate the complex intersection of public history, personal identity, and societal judgment. Throughout her life, Edda Göring experienced firsthand the weight of historical legacy, both in terms of societal judgment and personal identity. Being the daughter of Hermann Göring, one of the most prominent figures in Nazi Germany, meant that she carried a symbolic burden that affected every aspect of her existence. From childhood to adulthood, she faced challenges that stemmed not from her own actions, but from the actions and decisions of her father. Edda's reflections on this legacy, though private, suggest a nuanced understanding of historical responsibility. She recognized the moral and political consequences of her father's life and choices, while simultaneously asserting her own independence as an individual. Historians and biographers have noted that she never attempted to defend or glorify her father's actions, instead maintaining a careful distinction between understanding him as a parent and acknowledging the catastrophic effects of his political career. This capacity to separate personal memory from historical judgment illustrates remarkable emotional intelligence and moral clarity. It also sheds light on a broader historical phenomenon. The lives of family members of infamous figures are often shaped less by their own choices than by public perception and collective memory. Edda's experience exemplifies how descendants must navigate this delicate terrain, balancing the need for privacy, personal